times to the study of a topic like this. So to encapsulate it within the time indicated to me is almost an impossible task. Therefore, one would be kind of compelled to restrict or be choosy in terms of the aspects that one would like to highlight. That is a caveat which I wanted to make right in the beginning. The second thing is it would be easy to get lost in theorizing about the basic tenets of foreign policy or foreign policy making, or mired in endless debates about hard power versus soft power. But it might be more advantageous to move away from those purely theoretical discussions and constructs and look at foreign policy from the perspective of a practitioner. The second thing, or the third thing, is very often when you start discussing foreign policy or foreign policy making, people tend to territorialize it. What do we do with China? What do we do with the United States? What do we do with Europe? What do we do with Oceania? What do you do with Africa? What do you do with Latin America and the Caribbean? I intend to stay away from territoriality in my few remarks. A few things become self-evident. Unlike in the past, where one could distinguish quite clearly between domestic policy issues and foreign policy issues, today we are in a situation where these can no longer be seen as separate, distinct, watertight compartments. In fact, often they can be seen to be inextricably intertwined. This is true not merely of relations with neighboring countries, where such interface would perhaps be stronger than in other cases. Whenever you deal with, for example, Bangladesh, the politics of West Bengal immediately gets in. When you deal with Sri Lanka, the politics of Tamil Nadu gets in. When you deal with Nepal, the politics of Bihar and UP gets in. That's the given. But even when you deal with countries which are far away, we see that there is an interface with domestic policy, domestic politics. That's something which, again, we could keep in mind. The truism that foreign policy of any country is determined by its geography, history, the culture and traditions of its people remains true in the case of India too. The pursuit of national interest would seem to demand that India aim at increasing its power, influence and standing and project it on the global platform, while recognizing that the mirror image can only be as good as the original. Here again, when we speak of increasing power, influence and standing and project it in the global platform, something which we need to remember is that others respect only strengths. Nobody in the international system respects weaknesses. They respect strengths. So the intention, A, is to cultivate strengths domestically, and B, project those strengths internationally. Foreign policy should contribute to creating an environment which would help India achieve 7 to 9% annual rate of growth so as to overcome the worst forms of mass poverty and deprivation, disease and ignorance, ensure a peaceful periphery, we're talking about neighborhood, and expand options, opportunities and choices, both for the nation as a whole and for its citizens. Without doubt, India has a vested interest in the peace and prosperity of its neighborhood and in developing and strengthening relations with the major powers. In sum, India's foreign policy aims at preserving and enhancing the strategic autonomy of the nation, which enables us to pursue our national interests by ensuring and expanding a range of options, and provides it with the necessary policy space to deal with the challenges posed by the external environment and to pursue inclusive growth and ensuring dignity and security for all its citizens. India exerts efforts in creating a benign, facilitating, and conducive external environment for its continued economic growth and socio-economic development so as to derive maximum possible benefits from the existing international system. Reform of the system, if any, should serve India's long-term interests. India wishes to utilize trade and access to financial resources and intellectual property and technology for achieving the requisite growth and sharp increases in savings and investment rates, and for building up and modernizing infrastructure in its broadest sense of the term, from road networks to broadband connections. For this purpose, access to concessional finance wherever possible, financial markets and credit institutions, and access to natural, technological, and other resources are essential. Facilitating such access is one of the paramount objectives of Indian diplomacy. Another important requisite for development is knowledge and skill development. Food security and energy security are two other imperatives which take us to hydrocarbons, coal, oil, natural gas, in addition to hydroelectric, renewables, and nuclear. Finally, foreign policy is integral to national security in its broadest sense and defense policy. In the distant past, some countries used to practice isolationism as a matter of deliberate policy choice. In today's interconnected world, insularity is not an option. The reality and imperative of interdependence is overwhelming. In other words, we have no choice but to expand friendly relations with all countries to the maximum extent possible: political, strategic, economic, commercial, cultural, and defense. This would apply to almost all cases except one or two isolated cases where the relations have been historically adversarial, and where to this may apply, albeit only partially. We need to strive constantly to expand areas of agreement and minimize areas of disagreement with other countries. We have to learn to deal with differences with others respectfully. We should adapt to situations where competition and cooperation go hand in hand, without the former adversely affecting the latter to a considerable degree. Permanent interests would dictate continuity in foreign policy. For this, we need to have a clear understanding of national interest, broadly defined. We would need to stress our strengths: a robust democracy, diversity, pluralism, and tolerance, fundamental rights and basic human rights enshrined in the Constitution and made justiciable, independent, vigilant, and vibrant media, an active civil society, independent judiciary, and the independence of constitutional authorities like the Comptroller and Auditor General, the Central Vigilance Commission, and the Chief Election Commissioner and the Election Commission. Rights-based institutions such as the National Human Rights Commission and the Child Rights Commission have also done us proud. We would need to underplay our structural and other weaknesses and develop somewhat convincing explanations for them in instances such as regionalism and the rise of regional leaders, in other words, empowerment, caste-based discrimination, challenges of implementation, and other forms of serious human rights violations and persisting forms of discrimination. The security and welfare of members of the Indian community in different countries abroad is a responsibility of those in charge of India's foreign policy. This manifests itself through different ways, the most important of which are passport and consular services, consular access, and assistance for stranded Indians and those apprehended and detained by local authorities abroad for alleged violations of local laws and regulations, and at times Indians on short visits to these countries, which are the countries concerned, who lose their travel documents and so on. The responsibility for maintaining and nurturing close relations with the Indian origin community in different countries also primarily falls on the shoulders of the Ministry of External Affairs and its missions and posts abroad. instrumentalities required for dealing with bilateral and multilateral relations are somewhat different, and these require different orientations, skills, and training. The multilateral tracks often appear painfully slow and diffuse. However, as long as the interests to defend and promote are clearly identified, it becomes a relatively easy task. Multilateral diplomacy, although despised by some, is critical as it plays the most important role in global norm setting and rule making, where developing countries have been struggling over the past several decades to have their voices heard. Several transnational challenges confront developing countries like ours in today's world. These include international terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, traffic in narcotic drugs, arms, and humans, climate change, global pandemics and non-communicable diseases, maritime safety and security, piracy, securing the safety of sea lanes, sustainable management of fisheries and other marine resources, and many others, perhaps of a lower order. However, poverty eradication and socio-economic development remain our overriding priorities, and the challenge of Indian foreign policy is to assist the efforts of the Indian state in these tasks. The institutions of today's global governance, with the United Nations as its centerpiece, were devised more than 67 years ago. Reforming them to cater to the interests and concerns of developing countries and contemporary political realities is indeed a daunting task. Something which is not often appreciated and recognized by many of us here in India is the reality that, being a country with a large landmass, the second highest population, and a fast-growing trillion-dollar economy, India herself becomes a factor of peace and stability in the international system. Any major domestic event or development can have a huge impact internationally. For example, a drought in a few states, as we are experiencing now, can drive up the world food prices. Recently, there were reports in the media that some of the world leaders were prepared to overlook the so-called notion of reciprocity and were demanding that India receive them on bilateral visits, although, strictly speaking, it was not India's turn to pay high-level visits. It was actually India's turn to pay high-level visits to their countries. In other words, whether we like it or not, India is regarded rightly as a major player in today's international system, and our views on events and situations, even in areas where we are not directly involved, which are not in our immediate neighborhood, or where we are not perceived to have any direct stakes, are increasingly sought by others. This is true as much about issues relating to international economic, financial, and monetary issues in forums such as the G20, as those relating to peace, security, and disarmament. In many UN bodies and organizations, and even in specialized agencies dealing with technical subjects such as meteorology and telecommunications, India's views on various issues are sought constantly, which is a reflection of the enhanced prestige and stature which India enjoys in these forums and organizations and in the international arena generally. It's no doubt true that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, a fundamental transformation which has occurred over the past decade and a half, and the significance of which we are yet to grasp fully. There are two main consequences for this. First, the new enhanced stature provides us with many more tools and instruments in dealing with developments, actions, and designs which adversaries may try to force on us. This is amply clear to many of us who had to deal with such situations, say 20 years ago, and in the recent past. The contrast could not be starker. Second, We need to engage in rigorous studies about developments in different parts of the world, craft our own positions or policy papers, have considered responses ready, even when they seemingly do not have a direct impact on us, and articulate them when called upon to do so. Evasive generalities and clever one-liners will no longer do. Abstaining from taking positions is no longer an option. The current experience of India's non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council will surely provide many examples for this. It is the necessary price that India has to pay for being an emerging power. It is only in this limited sense that we can consider accepting the notion of greater responsibility as an emerging power and dismiss outright the other highly pejorative notion that it is because India used to act irresponsibly or without a sense of responsibility in the past and has to do so now in order to be given a seat at the high table. Because of the shortage of time, I shall refer briefly only to the question of UN reforms, leaving for the discussion later on the other suggested topics such as relations with India's neighbors, expansion of the UN Security Council, climate change, global economic and financial crisis, the Arab Spring and democratic transition, and any other topic that you may wish to discuss. Just 2 words about the UN reforms. The idea of reforming the United Nations is almost as old as the United Nations itself. Most of the reform attempts in the past, aimed ostensibly at revitalizing and strengthening the organization, have achieved minimal or no results. Given the political interest